Please be seated. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. All right. God, wake up. It's nice to see everybody. What is Africa to me? What is Africa to me? Copper sun or scarlet sea, jungle star or jungle track, strong bronze men or regal black, women from whose loins I sprang when the birds of Eden sang. 1-3 centuries removed from the scenes his father loved, spicy grove and cinnamon tree. What is Africa to me? Africa, a book one thumbs listlessly till slumber comes. Of course, that's from the great Harlem Renaissance poet, County Cullen. At least since the middle of the 19th century, African Americans have enjoyed an ambivalent, complex relation both to Africans and to the continent of Africa. Strident calls for massive migration and recolonization, a la Liberia and Sierra Leone, have been met just as vigorously from within the African American community, with equally strident demands that the African American's place is on these shores, that the American culture, the American economy itself, both have been shaped by black hands, and that the African American is a cousin at best, a distant relative at worst, an ironic New World African, if indeed an African at all. For Booker T. Washington, American slavery was a school, as he put it in his curious phrase, one that prepared the African for David Livingstone's famous 3 C's of colonization: Christianity, civilization, commerce. For Marcus Garvey, for the latter Du Bois, by contrast, slavery represented the primal rupture of a unified African people, a mystical, unified African sensibility, creating paradoxically a new world vanguard whose mission it was to help end colonization and usher in a new African world order, post-colonization. The romance with Africa was deep for my generation. I was 10 in 1960, the great year of African independence. In my 5th grade history class, I memorized the names of each new nation on the continent and that nation's leader. At 19, I made my first pilgrimage to Africa, flying to Ethiopia from Israel, where I had gone to see how American Jews dealt with nativity. And then on to Kenya. It was so cold, I have to say, in Addis Ababa, that I caught the first thing smoking and went further south. And then I went on to Dar es Salaam, and then took a bus into the center of Tanzania to a tiny village called Kilimatindi, where I worked in an Anglican mission hospital for much of the next year. Like many in my generation, I spent my first night in Africa stunned at the sight of an all-black society for the first time in my life, yet on the verge of tears at times at how far away from daily life in Africa that Black America actually turned out to be. After visiting 15 African countries over the past 27 years, studying and loving and teaching its literature, collecting its art, learning 2 of its languages, making a film about it, even giving my daughters Yoruba names, I have made my peace with the continent that struck such awe in my youthful imagination, but which has proven, quite frankly, in its modernity, to be in a generally perilous state at best. I call myself an African American, and I love visiting Africa. When I visit, I am, as Du Bois said of Harvard, in Africa, but not of it. And this, to me, is both a cause of relief at times and a cause of regret. To explore these themes, we have invited this panel together this evening. First, we will hear from Keith Richburg, and then our distinguished panel will respond, and following their responses, we will open up the discussion to you. Keith B. Richburg is the Hong Kong bureau chief for the Washington Post. He was the paper's African bureau chief based in Nairobi from 1991 to 1994, during which time he covered the civil wars in Somalia and Rwanda, among other stories. In 1993, he won the National Association of Black Journalists International Reporting Award, and the following year he won a George Polk Memorial Award for foreign reporting, and he was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. A graduate of the University of Michigan, he earned a master's degree in international relations from LSE, the London School of Economics. Keith Richburg now lives in Hong Kong. Now, as many of you know, Out of Africa is the personal story of Keith Richburg's 3-year odyssey in Africa, in which he asks, are these really my people? And I'm quoting here. Am I truly an African American? From Rwanda to Somalia, both of which experienced violent civil wars, as well as, from Rwanda to Somalia, both of which experienced violent civil wars, as well as famine, to South Africa and Zaire, Richburg takes the reader on a journey intended to eradicate the image of African American brotherhood with Africa, and if not exactly to eradicate, to problematize, as we put it. And I'm quoting, I'm tired of all the ignorance and hypocrisy and the double standards I hear and read about Africa, much of it from people who've never been there, let alone spent 3 years walking around amid the corpses. Talk to me about Africa, and I'll throw it back in your face, and then I'll rub your nose in the images of the rotting flesh. Richburg's conclusion about his relationship with Africa is provocative, disturbing. So excuse me, he continues, if I sound cynical, jaded. I'm beaten down, and I'll admit it. And it's Africa that has made me this way. I feel for her suffering, he writes. I empathize with her pain, and now from afar, I still recoil in horror whenever I see yet another television picture of another tribal slaughter, another refugee crisis. But most of all, I think, thank God my ancestor got out, because now I am not one of them. In short, he concludes, thank God that I'm an American, unquote. Out of America has received considerable attention in the short time since it has been published. In addition to appearing on the Today Show and the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, Mr. Richburg has earned the praise of commentators as various as Robert Kaplan and David Lamb for his very important book. About Out of America, one critic has written, and I quote, there are two great rewards in this book. One is the remarkably vivid portrait of modern Africa in all its soul-wrenching turmoil. The other is the engaging story of a young man who learns who he is by discovering what he is not. Black America has always imagined Africa like the adopted child imagines the birth parent. The dream is that Africa holds a truth for us. Keith Richburg, he writes, marches through that dream and finds that he was an American all along. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Keith Richburg to the ARCO Forum.
Great, thanks for having me here. I was actually a little bit afraid I wouldn't make it here when my flight from Washington coming up here was delayed by about 2 hours, but I did get here, and I'm glad to be here. It's nice. It seems like a very good turnout. So what is this provocative book that you referred to in your kind introduction there, Out of America? I'd like to stress, as I start, it's first and foremost a personal memoir. It's my memoir from my travels during 3 years and 3 months in Africa as the Washington Post bureau chief. And I say that it's a personal memoir because by saying that, I want to emphasize what the book is not. First of all, it's not a history book. So people looking for a comprehensive history of Africa and its experiences with colonialism and the Cold War era might be a little disappointed. It's also not a political science book, although my training is in political science, and I've tried to pepper my own personal observations with a little bit of analysis. But primarily, I did not write a book dedicated to analyzing models of government and the twos and fros. It's basically written, like as I said, from my personal observation and experiences. And it's another thing the book is not. It's not an encyclopedic survey of African countries. And some people, and I say that only because some people will always ask me, well, why didn't you mention this country or that country or the other country? During my time in Africa there, I traveled to about, I tried to add it up actually, I had traveled to about 23 or 24 countries before I lost count. Although not all of them are mentioned in the book, I do make some generalizations about the countries that I did visit. But what it is a memoir, and it's a memoir about my travels, and it's also a memoir about myself and the ideas and thoughts that were going through my head as I traveled through many of these countries. The book starts as I landed in Africa in 1991 in the fall. And at the time, it was for me and also for the continent a time of great hope and inspiration. Because this was, I was told as I set out, this was going to be Africa's decade of democracy. The Cold War had ended. We had seen the march of democracy from Eastern Europe through the former military dictatorships of Latin America, which had become democracies, to some of the countries of Asia that had moved from authoritarian rule, and I'm thinking like the Philippines and South Korea, for example. So the 1990s were supposed to be Africa's turn, and I was interested in going. I was excited about going to Africa for two reasons. Journalistically, I thought it would be a heck of a good news story, and I'm a journalist first and foremost. And this was going to be, I thought, the place to be. I was going to be watching a lot of these old dictators tumbling from Kenya to Zaire to Nigeria and across the continent. And secondly, I wanted to go because I think every black American feels an interest in going to Africa, to seeing the land of your ancestors, to maybe find a little bit of that missing piece of yourself. And so for that reason, I was also interested in going. As it turns out, my tour in Africa over those 3 years and 3 months coincided with what have to be two of the worst tragedies in post-independence African history, and I'm talking about the devastating famine in Somalia, and that was followed in 1994 by that genocide in Rwanda. The Somali famine, I mean, the estimates are anywhere upwards of 100 to 200,000 people who died. About 3 or 4 times that many were killed in the ensuing civil war. And as you may remember, that story became a U.S. military intervention when President Bush, responding to the public pressure, and I would like to think that the journalist on the ground contributed to that public pressure by sending in 20,000 American Marines onto the beaches of Mogadishu. And when I first went to Somalia, that was when I first started going into Somalia in January of 1992, it was one of the first cases, since I had been a journalist, and I'd been a journalist for a long time, where I could actually see a direct benefit of going into a place and doing reporting where you could actually have a positive impact very visible. And I thought that at the time I was there, I was seeing a lot of news coverage of the ongoing civil war in the former Yugoslavia. And I was wondering why this little country in Africa that was suffering so much more was not getting the proper attention. And I like to attribute that to I'd like to attribute the fact that I went in and out of there to the fact that maybe going as a black journalist to Africa, maybe I had a little more empathy with the people there. I was trying to force my editors to give this story equal play as they were giving the story in Bosnia. And as I said, I would like to help. I would like to think that at least the reporting by not only my newspaper, but other news organizations, New York Times, CNN, and others, may have contributed to that intervention. Now, as you know, that intervention turned woefully bad. It ended up in a guerrilla war with a hunt for a warlord, Mohammed Farah Aidid, and it basically collapsed in the image of an American serviceman's body being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. No sooner had the Americans departed from Somalia than the civil war erupted in Rwanda, with the shooting down of the plane carrying the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi in an incident still unresolved as to who fired that fatal shot. But what happened then, obviously, was the Hutu militia in Kigali and other major cities, and then spreading through the countryside, commenced on a campaign of genocide really unparalleled by anything since the Khmer Rouge genocide. And the Red Cross estimates were that up to 1 million Tutsi may have been killed in that genocide. And just to give you some comparison for that, I mean, the Khmer Rouge are estimated to have killed 1 million people during their reign from 1975 until the Vietnamese invasion at the end of 1978. And the Rwandan Hutu militia managed to kill that many people in about 3.5 months. And most of those killed were killed with machetes and hand tools as opposed to with machine guns and grenades. I went in, I saw a bit of that. I detail some of that in this book. And I talk about also going into the refugee camps of Goma and walking amid the corpses, as I say, seeing bodies stacked up like firewood, standing on the river at Tanzania, watching bodies that had been thrown into the Kagera River in Kigali that were floating down through Tanzania and floating upwards into Lake Victoria. And it was actually while I was standing on that bridge in Tanzania that I actually started to just think, reflect. You can't see that much death around you and not reflect. And I was just reflecting on how, first of all, maybe a self-absorbed reflection, but I was thinking how a lot of these victims, a lot of these bodies were black, and they looked like me. And that's what gave rise to this thought in my own head that, how fortunate my life had been. I had a loving family, I had an access to education. And here I was now very fortunate to be standing there, not as a participant, not as a victim, not in any way connected to all of this horror around me, but really to be standing there as a spectator, an outsider, an observer. And when I sort of, within myself, forced myself to think that level deeper, I really had to come to the conclusion that my own upbringing had been so fortunate because I had been born in completely different circumstances. And I tried to imagine what my life would have been like, hypothetically, if you could change places with someone. If I had been born there, for example, I was reflecting, would I have been one of these unfortunate victims, or would I have been one of the perpetrators of this heinous crime? And that's what gave rise to the thought within me that, obviously there's no excuse for that horrible crime of slavery, but now 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 generations later, I don't know when my ancestor would have been freed from slavery, I was thinking how fortunate I was to now be the beneficiary of this society where I was now able to stand there amid this horror as an observer and not as a participant. And so, I'll just wrap up by saying, this, as I said, this book was a personal journey, but I'll add one other thing here, which is, it's my story. It's no one else's story. And I went to Africa specifically with a purpose, and I went as a journalist. I didn't go as a tourist. I didn't go as an aid worker. I didn't go as a historian or an academic. Had I gone in another capacity, might I have come out with a different conclusion? Sure, certainly, no question. Might others go to Africa and have a different African experience? Certainly, and I'm not saying that my experience is any more authentic than anyone else's, or that I am speaking with any universal truths. And if you look at my book, you'll see the entire thing is written in the first person, because it's just my observations and how it affected me. And so that is specifically not to deny anyone else's authentic African experiences, which can be equally authentic to my own. And I'll steal the phrase from the moderator here. I do today find Africa still in a generally perilous state. And as I reflect back on my years there, I do reflect back on my good fortune. I empathize with the people there. I watch even today on these stories of what's happening in Zaire, the refugees lost in the bush in Zaire, wandering outside the scope of relief agencies. And again, I feel for their pain. I would like to see Africa's problems solved. I would like to see hope in Africa. But primarily, I'm actually quite glad that, that their suffering is not really my suffering, other than the human bonds one has with when one sees suffering on television. And so I'll end there, and I'll have a seat.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I will introduce our panelists, our respondents, in alphabetical order, and then I will sit down, and they will come one by one to speak at the microphone. Florence Ladd. Since 1989, Florence Ladd has been the director of the Mary Bunting Institute of Radcliffe College. Previously, she was Associate Dean of MIT School of Architecture and Planning, Dean of Students at Wellesley, Associate Director of Oxfam America, and a consultant to the Institute of International Education South African Education Programs. Florence Ladd holds a BS degree in psychology from Howard and a PhD from the University of Rochester. In addition to publishing widely on housing and urban environmental issues, Florence Ladd is the author of the critically acclaimed novel Sarah's Psalm, a luminous first novel about a brilliant African-American woman who discovers that Senegal is where she belongs. Leslie Payne. Les Payne is the assistant managing editor for Newsday. Winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Foreign Reporting in 1978, Mr. Payne spent 6 years in the U.S. Army as a captain, and during which he won the Bronze Star. He is the author of 2 books, Heroin Trail and The Life and Death of the Symbionese Liberation Army. The former president of the National Association of Black Journalists, Les Payne is also the recipient of the Unity Award from Lincoln University and the Journalism Prize from Howard. And finally, Matata Seydu. Matata Seydu is the political editor of the Sowetan, the largest daily newspaper in South Africa. At present, an International Nieman Fellow here at Harvard, he is studying management, racial issues, and press-government relations. He was banned in 1977 for his coverage of trials for a white-owned newspaper called the Sunday Post. Subjected to many detainings during the apartheid regime in South Africa. Seydou has also been an articulate recorder of the change occurring in the newly freed South Africa. He told the Evening Standard in 1994 that when he arrived in Pretoria for the inauguration ceremony of President Mandela, he was approached by a man he knew, the security policeman who had arrested him and dumped him in a cell where he was held without charge for 88 days. Seydou relates, and I quote, "We shook hands. He was happy to see me," he said. I told him I was happy to see him too, despite his past. Now a columnist for the Sowetan, Seydou has been a leading voice in the debate about the Truth Commission in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our panelists this evening.
Thank you, Skip. We have the ARCO Forum, the Harvard's Department of Afro-American Studies, the New Republic, and journalist Keith Richburg to thank for this session. Out of America, a personal memoir. Out of one man's revulsion and anger at what he has witnessed in Africa, his drawing his readers and listeners into his downward spiral of disillusionment, his words, his distancing himself from the history of conditions on the beloved continent, comes this opportunity to renew the public discourse on African and American relations. Thank you, Keith. At issue are the following: constructions of images of Africa and the interdependence of the United States and Africa. And gender may be at issue also, and I hope we'll get to that. With regard to image, to construct an image of conditions on an entire continent based on experience in its most troubled sectors seems unjust and perverse. To produce a new edition of negative stereotypes or images of Africans from a unilateral perspective, one man's point of view, one man's voice, fails the test of enlightened journalism, journalism that educates the public and prepares this nation for positive participation in global political and economic development. Negative images of Africa are linked critically to international understanding and cooperation between the United States and its more than 50 African nations. It's been suggested that in this country, Americans have to make Africa look bad for us to feel good about themselves. And if that's true, then we ought to look at the African image or images of Africa, and we also ought to examine the self-image of this country. America's image of Africans are deeply rooted in our images and rooted in the expectations and images of African Americans. Education about Africa and responsible journalism from Africa are useful approaches to the problems of image and the image of Africa. It's essential then that we bring more Africans into the media reports on Africa, that we give them time and space for their issues and their opinions, allow them to speak for themselves on camera. More credible and compelling are the voices of Africans who speak for themselves than are the voiceovers that speak about them. Turning now to the interdependence of the U.S. and Africa, Jeffrey Goldberg, in his New York Times Magazine article on the 2nd of March, an article called Our African Problem, and our was underscored or delivered in red, describes some of the conditions that have moved the continent toward what he terms a tipping point. Forcing it toward the edge of collapse are the chaos makers, the warlords, the kleptocrats. Coaxing it toward long-term stability are the corruption fighters, the entrepreneurs, the Democrats. Who ultimately wins matters immensely, Goldberg writes, matters immensely to Africa and to America. He notes that there have been genuinely democratic elections in a dozen countries within the past year, and remarks on the growth of peace and economic development across southern Africa. He concludes that nearly half of Africa's countries are moving at varying speeds toward political and economic liberalization. The leaders of these countries, these regenerating states, are, he writes, competent men, and they are all men so far, men who possess national, not tribal visions for their countries and who understand free market economics. They are not cruel or corrupt. They are, in short, leaders America can work with. End of Goldberg. Keith Richburg, perhaps, could have sharpened his focus on some of the positive developments in Africa. He admits that he saw, quote, heroism, honor, and dignity in Africa, particularly in the stories of ordinary anonymous people. Yet he allowed his report to be, quote, hopelessly skewed by the bad, close quote. While it may be impossible to redirect his point of view, it may be hopeless. Let us use this opportunity to amplify the discourse about the importance of an active partnership between the U.S. and African nations, partnerships that involve the recognition of mutual interest, contracts, strategic alliances, and funding arrangements. Many non-governmental organizations, and I speak with some interior knowledge of Oxfam America, for which I worked for 4 years, have been trying to develop constituencies in the United States that support the growth of healthy economic conditions, liberalized governments, and human rights throughout Africa. We need consistent and informed pressure on the White House, the State Department, and the Congress to create effective partnerships with African nations, particularly those with severe problems. We need more energetic and sustainable advocacy on behalf of Africa. This session is entitled Africa and Black Identity. I think it ought to be perhaps called Africa and U.S. Identity, because there are many of us in this country, black and white, who are deeply concerned about Africa, deeply rooted in Africa, and care very much about the prospering future, or the possibility of a prosperous future for the beloved continent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank Uncle. I think I should probably, at the outset, correct one error during the introduction. That is that Skip Gates said that in 1978 I'd won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on Africa. Actually, I won a Pulitzer Prize in 1974 as being a member of a team of investigative reporters who tracked the international flow of heroin from Turkey through France and here. However, I was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 1978, 4 years later, by the juries, but it was taken away by the advisory board. So I am, in addition to being a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter, a much rarer breed, a Pulitzer Prize losing reporter. And it hurts less when you win. But at any rate, we are to use a few minutes to put some distance, I think, between our view and that of Mr. Richburg, and I would do that. I will observe, I think quite understandably, put the least offending face on what some are calling a very offensive book, others are calling a very important book, and some others are calling a groundbreaking book. He quite carefully called it tonight, a personal memoir, which I found interesting. Haven't heard the NPR interview. And I think that those of you who read the book, and I hope you all kind of read it, Not necessarily buy it, but read it. He'll probably tell you to buy it.
Library.
I think you will find throughout, and I was not troubled by this, but I did observe it as you go along. He will say in the bluntest, sharpest tone, the most cruelest thing about Africans, the whole continent, all 740 million of them. And then 10, 20, 30 pages later, he would kind of take it off. He did that tonight with this personal memoir thing. He's very adept at applying the bandages after he has inflicted the wound, writers who are like that. But two precautions I would like to issue as we move into the discussion. One is that to the readers and those who are going to enter the discussion as well, is that Mr. Richburg has so entwined his personal view with his narrative of the book that it is impossible to discuss it without getting somewhat personal. And I don't like to get personal. We don't like to get personal. We like to talk about the ambitions of the book, the context and the substance. But it's very hard to do because of the nature of how he has entwined himself, which is intelligently explained by saying it's a personal memoir. The second point I would like to warn you about is that Mr. Richburg is at bottom a journalist. Now, I've been a journalist for 26 years myself. And one wag once described a journalist as a writer with nothing in his head and the absolute power to express it. At any rate, we journalists, more to the point, I think we journalists tend to cover not so much the healthy tissue of society in the world, but we, by all accounts, cover the warts and the imperfections of the world. We cover planes that crash, of course. We don't cover planes that land safely. However, I think we should be careful as journalists to make sure that we know the difference. And I'm afraid that in my view and reading of his book, I think in some cases, at some points, he is not careful enough to make the distinction between what those planes that crashed and those that perhaps may land one day. And the other point I think that he makes that I take serious exception to is that he singles out Africa as a basket case frozen in time. It may very well be a basket case, it may very well be the fourth world or the third world, but the whole idea that it is frozen forever, that there is no hope, there is no possibility for it to get out, I think is a serious mistake. And it's peculiar, because the peculiarity of Mr. Richburg's viewpoint is that he proceeds from his coverage, as he somewhat scanned over, and writing about the civil strife in Somalia, Burundi, Zaire, Liberia, and he draws these sweeping continental conclusions about the whole of Africa, all 52 countries, all 740 million African people. And he leaves very little room for nuance, very little room for variations, and he, page after page, at some points, continue kind of presenting Africa as a monolithic landmass of unrelieved misery and the absolute lack of hope anywhere along the line. That, I think, is a very serious work. At another level, I think, though, I must say that the book is well written, and of course it is provocative, which is why we're here. I would also say that he has, at one level, written a typical foreign correspondence book about Africa. Foreign correspondents, once they return from assignment, began to write about China, Africa, Istanbul, Pakistan, whatever. But on another level, the level of the personal memoir, perhaps, he has written a narrowly personal book. He concludes provocatively that as a black American, he chooses not to call himself an African American, which of course is his privilege, that as a black American, he feels no connection whatsoever with Africa. That's his right again. We're not surprised by that, when you read the book, because on page 9, he tells you that, quote, I was always more fascinated by European history and Asian politics than that vast unknown continent south of the Sahara. So I think he had kind of a predisposition to think those things that he ended up thinking about Africa. I won't get into the personal background. We can as the discussion open up. But one of my key problems with Mr. Richburg's analysis is that he takes the few frames of a few African countries he's been exposed to in the 1990s and freezes them in hopelessness. It's like, in my view, a foreign correspondent in the 1940s or the 50s concluding that China is utterly hopeless after returning from covering the internal strife, the mass murders, the starvation in China in the 1940s, or the excesses of the Red Guard in the 1960s, or even the Tiananmen Square in the 1980s. As Rostow and others have taught us over the years, nations and nation states tend to be living organisms that pass through stages tribalism, wars of independence, civil strife, all a part of the natural evolution. And yes, many of these stages are needlessly, terribly disruptive and sometimes catastrophic, as some of those countries are that he has covered. Africa is no different. Yet that continent is not at the same place it was 20 years ago when I covered the Soweto uprising. I covered the guerrilla war in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. I covered the famine in the Sahel, in Niger, in Mali, in Upper Volta. Those countries have changed tremendously since that time. I covered the border clash between Tanzania when Julius Nyerere chased Idi Amin not only out of Uganda and Kampala, but out of Africa entirely. Interestingly, there was a point in which Mr. Richburg mentioned a dictator on the continent presently who insisted that his entire name be used, otherwise someone could be shot or arrested. When I was covering Idi Amin being run out of Uganda in 1979, 1980, it was absolutely mandatory that whenever you referred to him in public, you use his entire name, and if you miss one syllable, that could be your life. And his entire name, of course, was His Excellency Idi Amin Dada, DSO, CBE, El Hajj, Honorable Doctor, President for life. And it was kind of like with the Roman gods. They were all immortal, and they were all dead. And he's no longer president for life. One last point that I would like to close on, and that is that he says, Mr. Richburg, at one point that he writes these bad things about Africa. Someone say that I'm doing a disservice to my race by pointing out these painful realities. I don't think that Mr. Richburg has done a disservice to his race at all. I think rather that he is doing a disservice to his education and to the craft of journalism. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought I would use this opportunity to do an ad for my coming book. And in that way, maybe book myself a space here in the future. My book is going to be called Out of Africa. An African Confronts America. And it is going to talk about my experiences here and the kind of dismal living conditions that I found my fellow black people living under in this country. And I hope to be able to end the book by saying that I'm happy that I was not enslaved. Because there, but for the grace of the good Lord, could have been me, shot yesterday like Notorious B.I.G. You are laughing, I hope, because you realize that that kind of approach and generalization is so out of line. And that is how I felt when I read the book. Because the theme of the book is not new. Africa is a continent of barbarians who have to be grateful for the arrival of the white man who saved them from themselves. Semi-apes who were found swinging from one tree branch to another, eating bananas when they were not eating each other. Keith says he found them virtually eating each other. This is not new and does not add any new insights to that argument. It's an argument from Tarzan, as he admits in the book, and he just picked it up, and I hope he makes some few dollars out of this. The book is a collection of experiences by a black reporter who was covering several war zones, and I think the emphasis is on war zones, and gives graphic descriptions of a war situation. The problem is when the war situations that he covered in Africa are then made up to be the norm of Africa, the unanimity of death in war, as in the killings in Srebrenica. But there's a generalization that comes out of that says Africans don't care about death. You find the bodies piled up and nobody seems to care that this is a person who once lived. And anyone who is an African or who has spent some time in Africa knows that we have many defects. But when it comes to somebody passing away, we hassle so much about death that if he found these heaps and heaps of corpses that were seemingly unattended, it must have really been a very bad situation, and he should have been able to understand that. He doesn't seem to have been able to do that. The destructions of war that he witnesses in Africa are attributed to Africans alone, as if today, as we speak, Sarajevo is standing upright. There are horrifying generalizations that are drawn from a few experiences in a few countries. And the book paints a picture of a no-good-for-nothing continent. This is due in part to a foreign correspondent's dilemma, parachuting from one quote-unquote shithole, to quote a word in his book, parachuting from one shithole to another. Now, if your job is to parachute from one shithole to another, you are not likely to see any roses, because roses do not grow out of shitholes. Amongst the many generalizations is one that says almost sex with neighbors' wives, it's almost a way of life in Africa. That is one of the generalizations. Quote unquote, almost everywhere in Africa, there's prostitution. Almost everywhere probably means the few urban centers that Keith has visited, with the emphasis on urban. Is prostitution in urban centers an African thing? Keith says in his book, on page 128, his expenditure on dog food and veterinary services was probably more than what most African governments spend on health care. Now, there are about 53 countries in Africa today. If there are those 53 countries today, Keith is saying he suspects that at least 27 of those countries spend less than he did on the dog food and veterinary services. And without really begrudging Keith's generosity to his dogs, one would need to know which countries he had in mind that spent less than he did on his unbelievably fortunate dogs. All of the continent is painted with one brush, save for South Africa. And I come from South Africa, and I get worried when we escape the wrath or end the congratulations of a man of Keith's caliber. And I start asking myself, what is it that we're doing wrong? Is it because when Keith was there, the government had whites in it? Or is it because of Mandela? Is South Africa still okay because of de Klerk? Or is Keith scared of attacking the world's leading icon, Mandela? I don't know. I have my own suspicions. And my suspicions are based on the last point I want to make here, which is how Keith related to Kenyans that worked either with him or for him. Keith describes all the foreign correspondents he worked with in Nairobi. They were white, many of them, but all of them have names and surnames. Where he does not even know the first name, he says so, as with the estate agent in Nairobi called Mr. Douglas. But the black Kenyans who worked with and for him are just George, Hezekiah, and plain old Reuben. George is a heavy womanizer, and Keith does not even know how many kids he had. There were so many, he says. He never even went into Hezekiah's little room behind the main house that Keith occupied. And there is no indication in the book that Keith even tried to understand Kenya through their eyes and experiences as people who were with him on a day-to-day basis. Instead, we hear all the expatriates talking, so that in the end, besides Keith's own observations and relationship with one prostitute girl, most of his time is spent exchanging views with white expatriates. And so, one looks at the book in its totality, and I'm happy to hear Keith say here today that he feels for Africa. He doesn't say so in the book. He's happy to be out. He's happy that he is not one of them anymore. And whenever the pictures come on the screen, he switches channels, which I think is very unfortunate. But then, I'm an African, I'm a Democrat. I grant him his right to see us any which way he wants. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I've asked Mr. Richburg if he'd like to respond before we throw it open to the floor, and he has generously agreed.
Yeah, I'm not sure which book I'm responding to because I heard so many versions of what I've written there thrown back at me, but I'll just point out just a couple of short things and then let the audience go back because I don't want to dominate here. A basket case frozen in time when I see no hope, I think you said, Mr. Payne. I never actually said
My
I...
language.
Yeah, that was your language. That wasn't my language. And secondly, I think I tried to say very specifically in there that, you know, I asked the question, do I see any hope in Africa? And I say that the problem is with me, I'd been there and seen too much. Maybe others can go there and see hope, but the problem is that I'd seen too many wars and it's time for somebody else. I never used to use the phrase a basket case frozen in time and I'd see no hope, right?
No quotes.
Okay, and the other thing is, I mean, you and the various people referred to my sweeping generalizations from these war zones. I didn't make any sweeping generalizations from war zones. The sweeping generalizations, quote unquote, were not from the war zones. The sweeping generalizations were made from the countries that are not at war. I made sweeping generalizations that a lot of the countries have the same problems of corruption, authoritarian rulers, or elections that are held and power not actually transferred. I never said the war zone of Somalia was transferable to any other situation, or the war zone in Rwanda was transferable to any situation. Those are confined chapters. If you read it very closely, as I'm sure you did, the sweeping generalizations you refer to the other problems that I think are very typical and that Africans themselves are complaining about, which are the corruption, the big men phenomenon, the phenomenon of ethnicity tearing places apart. But you did say it was a well-written and typical foreign correspondence book, so I'll take that as a compliment. Just two or three other points. Somebody mentioned that I think you mentioned that it would be the same as the foreign correspondents who early went to China and then concluded that place was a basket case and never would progress. And also, my friend from the Sowetan mentioned that he was going to write out of America or out of Africa. I wish he would. But if a foreign correspondent from Europe or Asia or wherever came to America and went to New York and got picked up at the airport and mugged on his way in from LaGuardia, and then he took a bus down to Philadelphia and got in the middle of a police incident involving a black person, and then moved down to Washington and got mugged again, and then went to Miami during another riot and then flew off to LA during the middle of LA riots and went back and wrote a book saying America has a race problem, I think that would be a legitimate book to write. But some might say, yes, but you didn't go to Kansas, and you didn't go to Iowa, and you didn't go to Nebraska. Okay, well, that's a fair point, too. Just one other thing, just a couple other things. I mean, first of all, I never used the word shithole in the book. That was a quote from someone else referring to shitholes. So I wanted to clarify that, because people might say I said that in the book. And then also, I think you didn't point out the fact that I also quoted at some length in the book a South African friend of mine who was a cameraman from WTN, who I traveled with quite extensively throughout Rwanda, who was sharing many of the same experiences as he was looking out the window. Sorry?
BC?
Mabisi, who was sharing some of the same experiences I was as I was traveling around. And just two other points. So, a lot of people refer to the 52 countries. I thought I made a point that I was referring to sub-Saharan Africa. I never covered Africa, Arab Africa of the North. And and just the last point I want to make, Shivan Naipaul went to Africa and wrote a book called, that was V.S. Naipaul's brother, and went to Africa. He traveled to about 4 or 5 countries, and he came back and he wrote a book called North of South, which was about his travels through Africa. I don't know if anybody's read that. And people took that for what it was, which was a memoir of his travels through the 4 or 5 countries of East Africa that he traveled through. And he said, here's what I saw, and here's how I feel. And he's an Indian descent, born in somewhere in the Caribbean. And he came out of his travels and said, here's how I feel as an Indian, going back into this place where there are a lot of Indians. Here's what I saw. Here's how I felt. And people took it for that, his personal memoir of his travels through Africa. I was talking to very recently to Eddie Harris, who wrote a book called Native Stranger, which was about his travels through Africa as a black American. And he told me, he said, the problem you have is that when you're black and an author, people want to hold you out for more than you are. If you write a book on your memoirs and your personal experiences, the white community wants to hold you up as some kind of a poster boy, and then the black community wants you to be will beat up on you for not being the spokesman, or for not, for being more than you are, for not just taking this and saying this is one person's opinion, one person's view, as they would sort of Shivan Naipaul traveling through Africa in 5 countries and writing a book called North of South. So I'll just leave it like that and see what the audience has to say.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's thank everyone. Now, there are 2 microphones on either side of the room. If you would hit the microphone, stand in line, and we'll go back and forth. Yes, please.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out first. And Mr. Richburg, I'd like to clarify a few things before I ask this question. The 3 panelists who were objecting to your book mentioned that you said something about the prevalence of prostitutes or prostitution in Africa. Is that correct?
Yes. Okay.
You mentioned barbarism, or barbarianism, or the conditions that you saw. Is that did you?
I don't remember using the word specifically, okay, barbarianism.
But alluded to the bodies and the.
That was in a chapter on Rwanda. I think I was talking about it. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to ask you: do you realize, this is good that you just mentioned this, being a black author as opposed to being a non-black author? Do you realize the implications of your book?
Sorry.
I said, do you realize the implications of your book?
Which implications are you referring to?
In the sense that you being a black author and saying something to the effect of you are glad that you are enslaved and not an African, and
said that.
Okay, well, from what I've gathered, I feel like it was just. I'd like to ask you how you feel that you come across saying all these things to America, to white America, about Africa, because I feel like whether you feel a connection or not, there is a connection between you and Africa, and between black people in Africa, and I just feel that. I guess this is more of a comment than a question, but I'd like to ask you if you see any greater implications than just being an author, because I feel like you being black in America, you are not just an author, you are a black author. You can't just deny that, regardless. So I'd like to my question is, do you feel any greater implications?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or a moral responsibility, you're trying to say. A particular responsibility that Shiva Naipaul wouldn't have because Shiva Naipaul is not an African American, right?
Right, correct. I mean, you can't just, you're not
He's
just
got it.
okay.
Okay, thank you.
I got
it. Keith?
That's a good question. The short answer is, I didn't actually write this. I didn't write things I wrote down easily. I don't need to. I have a job, right? I don't have any particular reason to open up my emotions and put them out on pages like that. I'm probably not going to make any money off of this. In fact, I'll probably lose money if you consider the time it took me to write the thing. So why did I do it? Well, because actually I first wrote a Washington Post magazine article that came out in the Sunday magazine as I was leaving Africa, just sort of summing up some of the conflicting thoughts in my head as I was leaving. And various friends and colleagues who read the article called me and said I should turn it into a book so it would have a wider audience than just the magazine article. And I wrestled with it because I knew some of the things that I would say would offend some and be controversial to others. But then the question became, once I decided I would do it, the question became, do I want to write an honest book, honest to me, the things that I felt, or do I want to write a book that's going to be pleasing to my colleagues, Mr. Payne and others? And, and once I started writing, and this went through various revisions, and I kind of went through layers and layers upon myself, it was like peeling the skin off of an onion. And after I decided to do it, I decided, well, I have to be true to myself first. And as I said, and that's the dilemma I had, which is I know that people were going to hold this thing up for more than it was. But, I decided if I was going to write it, I had to write it honestly to myself, right? Or because I'm a journalist, and I just figured I had to be honest. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Les?
Yeah, since you mentioned my name, let's lay aside the color business, which I think is an interesting discussion, and the provocative aspect. I think quite apart, African Americans tend to exercise a sense of duality, become the best journalist you can become, and in addition to that, concern yourselves about the African American community, all right? Let's lay aside that, and let's just talk about the journalism of it. My comment on it and my observation of it is that laying race, color aside, the conclusions were not supported by the evidence. What I have in mind is that, when I sweep in generalization, is that, for instance, when you talk about the Hutus, there seemed to be no room to accept the very obvious fact that there were villains and there were victims. There were killers and there were huge, millions amounts of people who were victims. And I don't think that you drew a distinction clearly enough at many key junctures of the book in terms of the people who were doing the killing and the people who were in fact being killed, even though they were the same tribe or a different tribe, whether they're Tutsis or Hutus or whatever. And I think that's a serious flaw of the book, just in terms of its journalism, in terms of its presentation. That was a flaw. And I think that you mentioned mugging earlier. I would equate it to the man who gets, it's an old saw in the African American community, maybe in the white community as well. Maybe you could tell me. But that when you get your pockets picked in London, your pockets are picked by a pickpocket. But once you get them picked in Harlem, they're picked by niggas. And I think that the conclusion sometimes tends to be that you should, in the first instance, perhaps develop a loathing for pickpockets, or the example you cited, muggers. In the second instance, you begin to develop a loathing for the people who live in Harlem and in Bedford-Stuyvesant. That's a problem. It has nothing to do with whether the writer's black or white or green. It has to do with how you marshal evidence and how you present, what the evidence shows. And that's a serious flaw of the book, quite apart from the racial aspects.
Keith, you want to respond, or the next question?
Next question.
Yes, please.
Yes, I'm fresh out of Africa, and a reminder of the gruesome scenery you might have seen. Truly, Africa is disconcerting, I must say. I'm here in this country as a refugee from Sudan. There is disease, indigence, all sorts of things that would disconcert a person, especially if you go visiting a place with opportunistic, expectations to go to a country where you will be housed and given all the amenities of life, and you fail to get that, by all means, you are quite justified in taking the downward spiral you have chosen for yourself. But I think this is what the African Americans are for. To me, I exiged the African Americans as a modern exilic community that was taken out of Africa per force. They shed tears at that time, but they bear the fruit of the future. You are going to Africa should indeed have been a forum for you to re-exert yourself. You are not speaking in Africa now. You are coming out of Africa vested with the power that we have lost as we are getting old in the continent. You are our young future, you African Americans. You go there, you find people dead in the streets, you get disconcerted simply because you had hotels in your head. You had, flowery women walking in the streets, all perfumed up in your head. And when you didn't see those things, you thought that was the end of the world. By all means, I would exhort that you once again re-examine your conscience. I come from the Sudan, a country in which there is slavery to date. Is that a fact? Yes, it is a fact. Is it bitter? Yes, it is bitter. Who is going to bail me out of that? By all means, my hope is in African Americans. Thank you.
Thank you. Would any of the panelists like to respond? It was more of a statement than a question, but Keith?
No.
No? Anyone? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Nahid Nenshi. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. It would be provocative of me to say that I am an African American. I can't get away with that for two reasons. The first is I'm not actually American, I'm Canadian. My parents immigrated to Canada from Tanzania 3 months before I was born, so African Canadian is as close as I can get. But the second reason that I can't really comes to the heart of my question for the panel. We've heard an accusation of Mr. Richburg saying that he's made sweeping generalizations about the continent of Africa. I haven't read the book yet. I don't know if that's true or not. But to turn the question a little bit, I wonder if that's also not true of the African American community here in America. In my few months in this country, I have been witness to some marvelous examinations here at the Kennedy School of the African American culture, which is a culture of which I know nothing or knew nothing before I came, know slightly more than nothing now. But at the same time, I wonder if there's a couple of things within the rubric of that community and that nomenclature which bother me a little bit. The first is, what does the term African American mean, and what does that mean to the reality of my ancestors in East Africa for a century, but not black? And what else does it mean in terms of thinking about Africa as a culture, a unified, harmonious culture to which we can go back, when in fact it's a vast mosaic of cultures? Even sub-Saharan Africa is a vast mosaic of cultures. It's hard for me to imagine that the Maasai living in my parents' hometown near Mount Kilimanjaro have really anything in common with the Zulu living on the velds and the Great Plains in South Africa. And I wonder how creating an African American community can in fact lead to as many sweeping generalizations as Mr. Richburg is being accused of.
Oh, good. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Who would like to respond?
Well, I like a little piece of it. I think it's a good question, without question. By the way, Canada is part of the Americas, so is South America. Laying that aside, so when you talk about Americas, it's north, south, central.
We have
then,
objections
right.
to that in Canada.
The other, yeah, I know, all 11 million of you.
27.
That vast. Anyway, but that's a part of the dilemma, and African Americans are struggling, as you know, I'm sure, to reconnect what has been severed. And so, yes, and I think it is present in Mr. Richburg's book, and is also present in the conversation and reference that African Americans often make to Africa. And that is, they talk about Africa when there is no unified Africa. In his book, this Sam Mabisi, who was the cameraman, I believe, from South Africa, when he went to, I think it was Zaire, maybe Burundi, he said he felt uncomfortable and an alien in this other African country. He did not consider himself an African. He considered himself a South African. He was Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, whatever, all right, in that country. So pretty much the way European-descended whites in America, and perhaps Canada as well, uh, might refer to a specific country in Europe as opposed to Europe. In fact, I pulled a contact sheet, not anticipating your question, but just in preparing. And one of the 1990 census, for instance, took a survey of white Americans to see how, when there's a slot that says, what is your ancestry? And they wanted to see how they referred to it. Now, interestingly enough, there are roughly 248 million people in this country. And I'll just give you a quick rundown. The number of whites, according to the 1990 census, who referred to themselves as Europeans was only 467,000 Europeans. You see, because they know precisely what their ancestry is. Now, in addition to that, you have Germans, 57 million, French, 10 million, English, 32 million, Irish, 38 million, Italian, 14 million, on and on and on. So they know precisely where they come from. You see, they don't say I'm a European. They say I'm French American, Italian American, and the list are here. What has happened to America, we don't know where we came from, you see, and that really is not some, now you can look at it any number of ways. Two key ways you can look at it, say, well, this is some idealistic way of trying to reconnect to a continent that you know nothing about. On the one hand, that's true. The idealism is not really idealism, but a very real way to reconnect. Because when you do travel there, you don't really fit into South Africa or Malawi or Nigeria or wherever, although there are places, and interestingly in his book, where, and one of the differences between Mr. Richburg and myself, you know, as I was reading the book, one is that he talks about his Detroit, where he said there's a part of Detroit, I didn't know this before, that he said that Detroit was segmented when he was growing up. He said there were, quite aside from the economic differences, but he said that East Detroit was people, for the most part, by people from Alabama, which is where I'm from. And that West Detroit was people by people who were from the Carolinas, you know, which is an interesting kind of construct, which I kind of didn't really know that. And quite apart from that, I mean, there's a whole reference, you know, to Africa, you know, is quite different. And you know, the concept of trying to find what country you're from, you know, and how comfortable you feel. I felt quite comfortable in Soweto, by the way. Not idealistically, I just felt comfortable there. And one last point, because it, you know, and that is that when he said that, and I don't want to get into this because this is inside baseball, and I'm trying to stay away from uniquely journalistic questions because this is the Kennedy School and not the Columbia School of Journalism. But he made the point that in terms of you know, the Africa reference, that when he was mistaken at one point, I think for a Zairean, and another one for, I believe, a Hutu, maybe Tutsi, whatever. All right, he said that was proof, you know, that, you know, he felt insulted by that, essentially. Now, when I was mistaken, yes, no?
I never said I felt insulted by it.
The sense I got was that you said that it didn't work. You know, that you couldn't work for that reason. When I was mistaken for Zulu in Soweto, I mean, I was proud. I mean, I couldn't speak Zulu.
Did you,
you know,
Les, did you pass?
Yeah, I couldn't speak Zulu.
Who mistook you? That's what we need to know, right?
It was a Zulu, thank God.
No, that's not what I was referring to. Was it at a club late at night? That's what
So you guys come to the city and you refuse to speak your mother tongue.
Oh, right, that's interesting. But let me say before you two respond, that just to put it in perspective, there's no doubt that a peasant in what is now Germany and a peasant in what is now England in, let's say, the 13th century had very little in common, didn't know about each other, a completely different set of values. You know, in what common culture did they share? But an intellectual from what is now Germany, and an intellectual from what is now, you know, whatever other country in Europe, shared a common language, Latin. They shared a religion, the Roman Catholic Church. They shared a canon of texts, et cetera, et cetera. And many people argue, I among them, that African and African American intellectuals have been reading and revising each other's books, and particularly addressing the subject of what we call Pan-Africanism or white racism in America, or colonization, decolonization in Africa, so that they're and educating each other, like Kwame Nkrumah, et cetera, so that a Pan-African intellectual culture, without doubt, did arise and has a long and very distinguished history, which we certainly teach here at Harvard and everywhere else in the United States. But both of those realities are true. It's a very, very, as we've all are trying to understand tonight, it's a very, very complex set of relationship, which is not biological. The notion that culture is biological was last held by the Nazis, and we all know how ridiculous that was, and you can't take a bad argument based on pseudoscience, put a black adjective in front of it and make it a good argument. It's a ridiculous argument. On the other hand, there are many cultural continuities between West Africa and the United States. The slaves who came to the New World did not sail alone. They brought their culture, they brought their gods, and many aspects of African American culture reflect some of the things that were brought during that brutal 6-week Middle Passage slave ship journey. But that if you had 3 heroes, Du Bois, James Baldwin, and Ralph Ellison, 3 of my heroes, they had widely divergent views about our relationship to Africa. Du Bois thought it was wonderful. James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison would get the I ain't left nothing in Africa award. You know, and this debate that we're seeing playing out here is very much part of our tradition. Florence Len.
We struggle with identity in this country. We struggle with national identity. We struggle with identifying ourselves in terms of national origin of ancestors generations ago. And it all has to do with our search for who we are in terms of a common nation, a nation whose national identity we all wish to claim, whose destiny we wish to share. That we claim that we are American must strike you, a Canadian, as very strange.
Thank you, Keith. Cedric, do you want? No?
Yeah, I just want to take 2 minutes and then I'll shut up because I know the time is limited here. And I wasn't actually going to address that point, but I know my friend Mr. Payne here is so committed to journalistic accuracy and against sweeping generalizations here that I thought I'd just better correct him. Nowhere in the book did I ever say that I was insulted being mistaken for an African. In one case, I said when I was mistaken for an African, I had a guy pointing an AK-47 in my face and about to kill me because he mistook me for somebody else. And in the other case, they wouldn't let me into the border in the country I was trying to go into because they thought I was traveling in a fake passport. So I never said I was insulted being mistaken for an African. I thought it was darn inconvenient to almost get my head shot off. And just one other thing I just wanted to make, I just forgot, and I jotted this down. When my friend on the end there was speaking, he mentioned that I didn't use the last names of Hezekiah and Reuben in Kenya as if to imply by that I thought somehow didn't have respect for them or something. I just wanted to point out that they're Kenyans, and they live in Kenya, and I was doing my best. I know people could track them down if they wanted to, but I was doing my best to try to protect them from any repercussions from the book by not including their last names. It had nothing to do with any disrespect for them.
Okay.
What kind of
I just didn't want.
what kind of danger did you foresee?
Because the Kenyan security police had been around by my house before, and I just didn't want to use their last names because many of the ideas I got about the government in Kenya I actually got from speaking with them, and I just didn't use their last names to protect them is all.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Yes, my name is Edward Chivilige. I'm a student at the Graduate School of Education, and I'm from Uganda. And I guess, Mr. Richburg, I cannot begrudge you your experience or say that you did not experience or see whatever it was that you saw, but I do sense that there's a little bit of a difference in hearing your presentation. I have not read your book, I have to say that up front, but I did read the article in the Washington Post, I think almost 2 years ago now. Granted, it was 2 years back. I have to say that there were some sweeping generalizations, I felt, in that I got the sense that you visited 6 African countries, Liberia, Somalia, a few, Rwanda, whatever, some countries that were at war, and said, thus, ergo, is Africa and the nature of Africans. And I was just wondering if in the rest of your journalistic experience, maybe you might visit Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, Srebrenica, Chechnya, and say, thus, ergo, is the nature of Europeans, or whether in your present position as Hong Kong bureau chief for the Washington Post, you ever go to visit the chaos in Burma or Afghanistan and conjecture that thus ergo is the nature of Asians. And I guess lastly, because I see you or feel you in a sense backing off a bit now from the very strong assertions you made in the book, because now you're saying that, well, this is my own personal reflection, but the book was written, or the article that I read was written in a fairly straightforward, I'd say that there were assertions. And you mentioned just a second ago that, if a black person writes something, people just can't take it for the nature of that. I have to say it's very difficult when, you say a black person is writing something, say a direct quote, "There, but for the grace of God, go I think there's a little bit, of a difference in something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Keith?
In answer to your questions, no, I'm not backing off anything. And then secondly, speaking about generalizations, most of the sweeping generalizations, if I can use a phrase from the other side of the table, they weren't talking about the war zones. They were talking about the problems of corruption, the problems of elections being stolen, the problems of these big men who won't give way to democratic rule. Yeah, yes, I was making some generalizations that democracy did not take root in African countries the way people thought they had, as opposed to the war zones, which were self-contained units.
In all African countries?
No, not in all African countries. In fact, I usually said in most that I covered, or I saw elections stolen, and I list a few places. When I talk about problems of corruption or problems of lagging economic development, I usually would say things. I was pretty careful in my words. I'm a journalist. I would say most countries are not growing like they should. Most elections that I covered were actually shams. So, people tend to, it's been, as I've been going around talking about the book, a lot of people like to say, oh, he only went to these 3 countries who were at war and made generalizations. They don't point out the fact that I do talk at great length about countries that were not at war, like Kenya, talk about Cameroon elections being stolen, I talk about the dictator in Gabon, I talk about Nigeria, et cetera, et cetera. But people don't like to say that. They like to just say, oh, he only went to Somalia, Rwanda, and Liberia.
This is true.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes?
I'm Philip Winslow, and I confess to a slight conflict of interest here in that Mr. Richburg is a friend of mine, and I covered Africa from 1993 through 1995, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Rwanda, Zaire, and Sierra Leone. Excuse me. So that said, now I know the 2 gentlemen at the end of the table, Mr. Payne by his excellent reputation at Newsday, and have met Mr. Tsedu and interviewed him in Soweto when he was there. And this, basically what I've got to say is just kind of to the people in the audience who might be put off by some of the criticism, people who might be inclined to read the book. Now, also, I'm not acting as a sales agent for Mr. Richburg's book. But I think Mr. Payne says that Keith does a disservice both to his education and to journalism, and Mr. Tsedu goes on about the sweeping generalizations. I just think that as 2 excellent journalists, and you both are, that those statements are just a bit inaccurate. And I found that you're talking about the generalizations in the book, that in itself was a bit of a generalization, and it just didn't, I would just say again to the people who have not read the book, that is not what I read into it. For 2 years and 2 months, I saw what Mr. Richburg saw in some of those same countries, and I can't address obviously what he can about being a black reporter covering Africa, but certainly about the events that he covered. So I just wanted to respectfully suggest that the remarks of the 2 gentlemen, Mr. Tsedu and Mr. Payne, are, I found them as excellent journalists, that the remarks were just a bit inaccurate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Would you like to respond?
Yeah.
Matata?
I don't think that what I said here was purported to mean that there was no killings in Rwanda, and that Keith did not see bodies floating down the river going towards Tanzania. There are those killings that are taking place there. It's a war situation as in any other war. That's why I was referring to Srebrenica, where there are mass graves too there. But when you read the book, whatever mass grave you find at Goma, it's because the people there are Africans, and that is the point I was making. Does it then mean that I am saying the killings can be defended? No, the killings cannot be defended at all. And Africa itself, as a continent, in terms of its leadership, does not defend those kinds of things. And there are people who are spending days and nights without sleep trying to find a way to stop those problems. Mandela is involved with the Zaire problem now, and there are some hopes in that direction. And that, for me, is good, because those leaders, unlike Keith and maybe me as journalists, who can go in and get a story and a good adjective and a front page and then go away, those leaders cannot do that. They have to struggle with that situation and try and find solutions, even if the body count keeps going up.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I'll preface my question with a simple story. I was working in Boston in 1985, and a friend I'd paid a visit to us had taken one too many. He was a South African frustrated in the US. And I got lost, and I asked some of the young fellows who passed by, where is this place called Roxbury? And they said, well, you're not from here. We can tell from the accent. I said, yes, I'm not from here. I said, well, I'm from South Africa. I said, oh, brother, you're catching hell down there. I said, yeah, I don't know about that. Do you go to school? He says, no. Do you have a job? He said, no. I said, I go to school in the United States, and my education is securely paid by this government, and you are going to end up in jail. Who's catching hell? And he said, brother, that's deep. but the point...
And he did not mug you, right?
Yeah.
No, okay.
But the point is, I remember at the time, there was a Free South Africa movement, which was very strong in the US. And a lot of people supported that movement. And every time I got a chance to speak on the radio or TV, I'll always raise the issue that I'm fascinated by the support that we get from the United States, the people. But why aren't they so concerned about racism in this country? And I came back a number of times, and I always ask myself that how do you explain that 2/3 of the prison population is always attributed to one race? And it reminds me of what Dudu said, that the water that separates us is not thicker than the blood that unites us. And I found the African Americans very involved in the struggle. And I'm not too sure what consolidation in terms of those ties does books like this do. But my point, my concern with the book is its lack of politics. I mean, in Angola, we have more people who are handicapped, who are crippled. And if one were to ask who has been responsible of funding Savimbi, the CIA will tell you it is us. Mandela was arrested in the 60s. Who gave Mandela away? Now they accept that it is the CIA agent. South Africa was supported by the United States during the times when we were catching hell. So the whole presentation of all the Africans' problems is not located within the political discourse and the role that this government has actually played.
Could you make it into a question?
So I would like to know whether it was an oversight on the side of our distinguished journalist, or it was just deliberate.
If what was an oversight?
What, excuse me? Sorry, what was the oversight?
The political side of it, the political context with which some of these things were occurring.
Oh, I see what you mean.
No, because if I don't know, have you read the book, by the way?
As Matata has read it and he has given me quite a briefing, I'm not too sure that I have time.
I would suggest an unbiased criminal reader. But no, for example, when I talk at some great length about Zaire and the corruption problem in Zaire, I point out the fact that Mobutu was a tool of the United States, was propped up by the U.S. and the CIA because they needed the airstrips in Angola, et cetera, et cetera. I thought in the case of, for example, where I discussed Rwanda at great length, I also mentioned in there the fact that the Belgians exacerbated that problem by using the Tutsi as administrators when they were there during the colonization period. So yeah, I mean, I don't ignore the history at all. It is in there, although I'm sure you didn't get an unbiased version of the book.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to take moderator's privilege and ask a question of the panel, and starting with you, Keith, which is that, I get sick to my stomach when I think of the African Americans who've been apologists for the most brutal regimes in Africa. We don't have to name names, but the people who went to Uganda to defend Idi Amin. The people who are now going to Nigeria to defend the butcher, fascist Sonny Abacha, who turns my stomach. And then the people would say that for me to make a statement like that in public is betraying our African heritage. You know, to wash dirty linen, and et cetera, et cetera. It sounds to me like rubbish. And I think that one of the most interesting questions that's been raised this evening, and really what the disagreement is all about, and I mean, one key thing that the disagreement among the panelists is all about was raised by this charming gentleman in the front row in his first question implicitly, which is there a special obligation of an African American writing about Africa to resist the possibility that his argument could be appropriated for bad ends, right? I mean, that is the subtext that we're talking about. And I'd like your direct response to that. Keith.
Well, on specifically the question you mentioned, which is sort of Black American, African American support for some of these dictators, I think there's a positive obligation on the part of journalists like myself and others who go to Africa to point out the fact that some of these guys are thugs and dictators and they're repressing their own people. You know, and in one chapter of the book, for example, in one chapter that nobody actually, that was the only chapter nobody criticized in the book, you know, I take to task some of these leaders who went out for the last African American African Summit. Some of these people who are my, you know, heroes to me. These are prominent figures in our civil rights movement in America who made their name marching on behalf of democracy and equal rights and liberties in this country, and all of a sudden they go over there to Africa and they dine with dictators. And I think that's wrong. And I think that we have an obligation to point out, and that's, you know, I thought I had a positive obligation to point out the fact that, you know, we don't need to see our civil rights leaders from America shaking hands with the likes of Babangida and Sani Abacha and Omar Bongo in Gabon and Paul Biya in Cameroon. Sorry if I'm generalizing, but I'm just trying to list countries now instead of saying African.
Those are very specific names.
Yeah, I got very, very specific there, right. Yeah,
Proper name.
Okay.
Yeah,
You know.
okay, so yeah, no,
It's
I
not a
think we have a
generalization.
positive obligation to point out these guys are bad and that these guys, their countries are
Well,
corrupt.
Least. I'm
I
sorry.
think Florence.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I don't think we need to be apologists for dictatorships, apologists for violations of human rights, apologists for governments or political leaders who are undermining the positive possibilities of Africa. Absolutely no. I think African Americans, like other reporters, visitors, missionaries, whatever takes one to Africa, one should go with an open mind and with the intention of not bringing back an exaggerated view that represents one's own self-absorption and one's own, I don't know, mercenary interest.
Les.
Yeah. We're on journalistic ground now, so he moved us on to journalistic ground.
Right.
Let me just say very clearly, this is not a difference between Mr. Richburg and myself in terms of journalism. My view on journalism, I'm well on the record going back to an episode he mentioned with Milton Coleman, the Washington Post. I mean, my view domestically first and then on Africa is that I think the role of the journalist, the specific role of the African-American journalist to the African-American community and the broader community by extension, there's no way you can separate the two, is to ferret out the truth, fearlessly and fearlessly verify and print it without regard to who it hurt, helps, whatever. Now, I think the role of the journalist is to keep the Jesse Jacksons and the Rangos and the Sharptons of the world and to hold them accountable, but by the truth. In other words, ferret out the truth, that's what we're trained to do, tell it, and if the truth hurts them, let them stand naked before that truth. This is our special role. Right. Now, on Africa, similarly, so we don't differ on that. For instance, when I was covering Uganda, I mean, I filed a story which said essentially it was a notebook saying that the nation of Uganda, this is in 1980, has undergone a Holocaust. That all of these people that I talked to. Now, let me just back up. The episode is that there were a group of black journalists who had gone to Uganda, courtesy and payroll of the Ugandan government. Right. I don't want to name their names. There were three of them in the New York area. And they had gone and come back and said, Idi Amin could not have killed all of these people because he looked like my uncle.
Right.
I mean, wrong. I mean, this guy killed, you know, I mean, he had put his country through a small cockroach, he put Uganda through a Holocaust. It was genocide. There's no other way to get around it. And you write that, and you let the truth, the chips, as they say, fall where they may.
Right.
But by the same token, I don't think, and when I was talking about to your great defender over here, when I was talking about journalism, I don't think you move beyond that point to say that Idi Amin has killed upwards of 300,000 of his own people, not really his own tribe that was begun, and he was a conqueror, but you don't say Africa, you know, is in this whole thing. And believe me, there were bodies in the river, and the crocodiles were eating them. And I wrote about that. And everyone I talked to in Uganda, every person I talked to hundreds, had lost a relative.
Yeah.
Not a friend, acquaintance, a relative, everyone. All right, now, so you write that. But you don't say Africa, you know, is hopeless, because it just so happened that Julius Nyerere sent 25,000 of his troops, bankrupted Tanzania, sent 25,000 troops into Uganda and chased Idi Amin out of Africa. You see, Tanzania is different from Uganda. Julius Nyerere is different from Idi Amin. Isaias of Eritrea is different from Mobutu. Museveni, who I met shortly after that, is different from Kenneth Kaunda. That's what I'm saying. And there is no Africa in that sense. I mean, I'm responsible. You mentioned my captain in the Army, but I now run our foreign reporting and have since 1980. And we've won 3 Pulitzer Prizes in the last 6 years on foreign coverage. And that foreign coverage, and by the way, one of them was in Africa on the Ebola plague just last year. And that coverage has to do with finding out what is going on and printing, and not leaping from the specifics of Rwanda or Eritrea and talk about Africa.
Okay, thank you. Matata.
Okay, as I said, I come from South Africa, where the president is Mandela. Now, the issue of whether, as a journalist, when you see something that is true and is wrong, you then have to hide it, because if you were to say it, you would be hurting the race. That it's not a Bible that I read. If Mandela goes about appointing truth commissions that come with funny amnesties, where people will no longer have to answer for their crimes except to go before Bishop Tutu and say, please, oh Father, I've sinned. I say to him, I write that, and I say, that is not on. We need justice in this country, because what you're doing now is a slide towards anarchy. If his government or his officials are involved in corruption, we write about that. And the point that I personally, and I think Les is also making about this particular book, is that from a few incidents, a mountain is built. We were being told here that we were making generalizations about generalizations. But that is what is happening here. And I personally find it incredible that anyone can go to Goree Island, which was the holding kennel for slaves before they were shipped over here, and somehow come out of it feeling as if he was standing at the staging post towards freedom. I have utmost difficulty with that kind of approach. And that is what I'm saying here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Mr. Richburg, I was wondering where you lived in Nairobi.
Where I lived,
Yes,
a neighborhood called Laratio.
yes. Last year I was living on Laratio Crescent, I believe a few houses down from where you used to live, number 74. And that neighborhood is a fairly wealthy neighborhood with a lot of gates and a lot of loud guard dogs. And personally, I found the most difficult experience living in Kenya and working in Kenya was dealing with the people who worked in that neighborhood. How you walk along the street as a white person, clearly a person who lives there, and the people who work in the houses around there won't even talk to you or look at you or smile because they're afraid of you, because they're afraid of the people they work for. And the most difficult experience of my time there was actually coming home from dinner with your successor, Stephen Buckley, who's now the Washington Post correspondent. We had a nice middle-class intellectual dinner, and we, discussed theories about Africa. And I came home, and the person who lives in our landlord's house had been bitten by a dog because he got drunk. And his little boy came over to ask if we would help because the Asian landlord wouldn't help. And the hardest thing was realizing how much I didn't want to go and help, how much I didn't want to go into that little tiny room of poverty that I lived next door to for a year. So I'm just wondering if, as a neighbor, you could tell me how you got along with the people that worked for you.
The people who worked for me,
Yes.
other than, well, my office assistant, who didn't come to my house, he worked in the office we had downtown, was a thief, basically. He was stealing money from me. The people who worked in the house where I was, Hezekiah and Ruben, who my friend at the end talked about, we became good friends. I'm quite close to them even today. And that's why I had to correct that when you seem to think I was implying some lack of respect for them. And when I say, for example, that Ezekiel lived in a small house on the grounds of the house, the main house. And the reason I never entered his house was because I was trying to respect his space, because I kind of figured that I didn't want to intrude or onto what was the only little bit of privacy he had on this house. And no, so I got along quite well with them. They'd been working for the Washington Post for at least a dozen years or so. And so, so I had a very good relationship with them. And in fact, they were my window on Kenya, and all of my, excuse that word again, generalizations about how bad the Kenyan regime was and how corrupt Moi was, I usually got from sitting around chatting with Ruben and Ezekiel.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Richburg has an interview at 10, so we have time for one quick question.
Okay. I'm an abolitionist. As we sit here tonight at Harvard, my name is Charles Jacobs from the American Anti-Slavery Group. As we sit here at Harvard, black people are being bought and sold in Sudan and Mauritania, being transshipped into Libya. I'm kind of a little annoyed at you, Mr. Richburg, because if abolitionists hadn't won the battle here, you certainly wouldn't be sitting in Harvard saying how much you like America. So I think at least you have the opportunity. I mean, I think that you are the most obliged person in the world to help lead the fight against slavery in Africa. But I also have a problem. I'm worried about the other panelists who themselves are worried about negative images of Africa, because we've been fighting now for 4 years. We've now got 6 or 8 grassroots groups across the country, all black-led except the one in Boston, fighting to get that issue on an American agenda. And while we have tremendous rank-and-file support, most of the black leaders, Jesse Jackson, for example, although the NAACP says they support us, we don't see any groundswell. There's not one major black leader who said to his constituency, this is something we have to act on. So I would ask the rest of the panel, what could we do to make more of that happen?
Is there a quick response from anyone? Florence?
I would appeal to Trans-Africa, which has been very progressive and responsible, and look to Trans-Africa for some leadership on this issue in a way that would engage the black community and heighten the visibility of the issue.
Well, Randall Robinson knows about it, has said a few words, but has not said anything more.
I think that
A final word?
Yeah. I think that one has to also understand the kind of situation you're dealing with when you talk about the slavery in Sudan, the people who are being shipped from Sudan into Libya, that there is a war going on within the borders of Sudan, and until you are able to resolve also the underlying causes that lead to the black Africans in the south of Sudan being enslaved by the Arabic North Islamic people, until you are able to resolve that kind of problem, you are forever going to experience the problem of slavery. So that when you look at that problem, it's not just slavery per se, it has a whole political agenda on which it is riding, and it is that agenda that needs to be addressed. And I think there are efforts that are being made to address the agenda of the Sudanese problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank our panelists and thank Keith Richburg. Excellent discussion. Thank you.
You didn't beat up on me too much.
Oh, no. We had to stop anyway.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it was great.
Really appreciate it.
And it was on CNN.